Chances are you probably don't follow Uno on Facebook. I'm talking about the Uno card game, and what's been hilarious for me is that over the past couple weeks, they keep posting these photos that have official rules that they wanted to clarify. That's not necessarily funny just in general. If Konami posted a new photo every day that said, oh, you can only normal summon once per turn, you can special summon as many times as you want, people probably wouldn't freak out. But the reason people are getting mad at the Uno card game is that they're posting rules that people don't agree with. Uno, like all popular games people play with their friends and homes, things like Monopoly and Life, etc., is one of those games where people, when they play at home, are going to make up their own rules. Many of us got started on Uno just by hearing what our family told us the rules were without actually sitting down and reading the boring rulebook. I mention this because in the comment section, people are freaking out about how the Uno card game is now becoming more boring with these rules, even though they were the ones playing it wrong and these have always been around. This pertains to today's discussion because in today's video we're talking about 5 myths about old school Yu-Gi-Oh! And you don't want to be the type of people that react the same way as those Uno commenters. All the things that I'm going to talk about in today's video are supportable either by the past historical documents that we have in terms of tournament results or in the actual rulebook. And you can even go back and see that I recently opened an old rulebook in 2002, the Kaiba starter deck. That's the very first rulebook that the TCG had, so if it's in there, it's been in the game forever. This might suck to hear, at least some of these, because you have your own perception of what old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Really was like, but all these things are backed up by actual evidence, and I think that the biggest thing to remember here, just like in the case of Uno, is that just because you played Yu-Gi-Oh! One way with your friends or your family doesn't mean that's how the game was supposed to be played, especially at a tournament level. And I'm not making this video to say you're wrong for changing the rules, because when I first started with Yu-Gi-Oh! We barely knew the rules at all, and even when we eventually learned them, there were still some issues that arose. However, when we're talking about older cards and we're talking about older strategies, it's important to all know what actually happened, what the rules actually were, so that we can have educated discussions about those points. For example, the life points were never ever anything less than 8,000. They weren't 2,000 like the original anime, they weren't 4,000 like the later seasons of the anime, they were always 8,000. Now this is something that I get a lot of questions about, because when I talk about cards like Magic Cylinder, I always get comments from people that say, well, this card used to be really good in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! With 4,000 life points. That simply isn't the case and never has been, and I understand why it's so confusing. In the anime, the main reason that they have to have less life points is that the duels don't take longer than they're supposed to. I mean, already the duels take several episodes sometimes, so if they had 8,000 life points, you'd have to make a lot more powerful strategies that the duelists are actually using, or the games would last a lot longer, something that they probably want to avoid. In the same way that the anime had less life points so that players could actually finish the game within a reasonable amount of time, many old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Players when they were a kid played with less life points for similar reasons. If you only have recess or lunch break to actually sit down and play a couple games of Yu-Gi-Oh!, of course you're going to want to play with less than 8,000 life points. I don't think I ever played with 2,000 life points. I think I mostly stuck to 4,000 and 8,000, but when you only have a few minutes and you want to fit in more than one game, you definitely have to lower the life points just to fit in a few more duels than you would have if they were at 8,000. There also never was a situation where you didn't have to tribute for level 5 or higher monsters. This is actually something that came up when I opened that 2002 Kaiba starter deck. I had multiple comments from people saying things like, well, you don't need to complain about some of the bad level 5 monsters in the deck because I mentioned Rude Kaiser several times, and people said you didn't have to tribute for them back in the day. This is false, and what's funny about that is that in that very video, I opened the 2002 rulebook and I flipped to one of the pages just kind of randomly, and it happened to be a page that mentioned tribute summoning. Yes, from the very beginning of the Yu-Gi-Oh! Card game, I know the anime didn't follow this rule, but level 5 and 6 monsters required 1 tribute and level 7 and 8 monsters required 2. This has always been in the game. However, just because we didn't follow the rules back in the day doesn't mean that they weren't in place, especially at tournaments. This means then that cards like Rude Kaiser and Sword Stalker simply are so terrible, and that makes sense because you don't think that Konami would print a starter deck full of really weak lower level monsters and then include some normal summonable monsters with 2,000 attack. That just doesn't make sense. Konami didn't balance things like that back in the day. Things were balanced more so around tribute attributes than they are in New School Yu-Gi-Oh! That was the main way that Konami was saying, okay, if you want to summon these big monsters, you have to use something like polymerization or actually set up enough tributes to summon them in the first place. The last incorrect ruling that I want to directly take from people watching the anime and then thinking that's how the game works is FaceUp Defense position. Now, of course, if you special summon something with something like Monster Born, you can summon it in defense mode. That's perfectly fine. What I'm talking about is that even to this day, there are people that think back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! When the game first came out that you could summon monsters in FaceUp Defense mode. This isn't true. It never has been true. You've always had to set monsters. I don't know exactly the reason that they didn't let you do that in the anime. I know at some points in the anime they did actually let players do that, but I think for a while it was just better for the viewer experience to see a monster being summoned in defense mode so you could see the artwork and see the monster come to life. I don't know the exact reasoning, more so than like the other two where I actually felt like I had a pretty good idea of why they were changed when they went to the TCG, but as far as looking at the anime, cards for the most part were able to be normal summoned in defense mode. With the TCG though, that's never been the case. You've always had to set them in face down defense position. This makes sense because many of the early effect monsters actually were flip effects, implying that you can set them face down. But I don't only want to spend this video talking about anime rulings that weren't true when they came to the TCG, so let's talk about more of a card analysis. The Egyptian god cards not only didn't exist in old school Yu-Gi-Oh!, they also weren't good when they came out. Those are two very common complaints that I see on my Why Nobody Plays the Egyptian God Cards video, and while I'm not showing any comments in today's video, I just want it to be known here that I get a ton of people that say things like, well, you're just evaluating these cards with modern techniques when these used to be very good back in the day. First off, the very first legal release of any of the God cards was in 2010, and just so we're clear here, the one that you're seeing on the screen right now is not that original 2010 version. That version, like the original 2011 and 2012 copies of Ra and Slifer, all had alternate artworks, and that was the original release. We wouldn't actually see all three of the God cards in the same exact set until Battle Pack 2 a couple years later. However, even in 2010 and 11 and 12, when they were first coming out, they weren't seen as competitively viable options and weren't really featured in any top strategies. But where does this stem from? Well, it comes from two different areas. First off, in the anime, and like I said, I'm not talking about an anime ruling, but in the anime, the God cards are hyped up as some of the best monsters in the game, and some, I think they actually say that they're not even monster cards, they're God cards. They're one step higher than monsters, and while that isn't true, I think a lot of people heard that and then applied it to when they thought of the God cards back in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! I think people remember though that they were in old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Because if you just heard me, I said that the legal versions didn't start coming out until 2010 through 2012. However, the illegal versions, the versions that you can't use in any tournament setting and can only use casually because, spoiler alert, they're not legal and don't have any real effect text, those things have been out for a very, very long time, and many people, including myself, had copies of those unplayable versions of the God cards that we then used on the schoolyard to beat our friends. I remember specifically that I bought an obelisk from eBay that, looking back, definitely was a fake version of the card, and still I played it in my deck. I thought it was really, really cool. I didn't notice the difference. However, just because you played the illegal versions of those cards back when you were a kid doesn't mean that they were powerful, because yeah, you couldn't even use them in a tournament setting. And I realize that many people watching this video, including myself, are going to say things like, well, I wasn't going to tournaments back in the day, so I don't care how good a card was in a tournament setting, I only care about how good they were against my friends. The problem is that that's like comparing playing backyard football with your friends to what actually makes a competitively viable football strategy when you go into the NFL. You just can't compare the two things, because in one case people aren't taking it seriously, in one case people are taking it seriously. So when we look at things like the Egyptian God cards and we say, well, were these cards good in old school Yu-Gi-Oh? The answer is sort of twofold. First off, they didn't even exist in old school Yu-Gi-Oh, but also when they eventually came out as legal playable copies, they still weren't very competitive even by 10 years years ago standards. And we're going to take that example of the God cards and then apply it in a broader sense for the final entry in today's video. The most common myth with old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there wasn't a meta game. There weren't meta strategies, and that every single card and every single deck was viable to an extent. This is simply not true and never has been true, and it's one of the most common complaints that I see from ex-Yu-Gi-Oh! Players about new school Yu-Gi-Oh! It is true that archetypes and themes are more popular in 2019 than they were 20 years ago. However, that's not what meta means. That's not what a metagame refers to. A metagame only refers to if there's one standard deck that's topping more than the other decks out there. Sometimes it's one deck that's overpowering all of the other ones. Sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4. Those are going to be considered the meta strategies of the time period, of the format. When we look at old school Yu-Gi-Oh!, when you look at the first couple World Championships and Shonen Jump Championships, you're going to see a pattern where, while it is true that archetypes are not dominating those tournaments because they don't exist nearly in the same capacity that we think of them these days, you see the same types of deck pop up over and over and over again, and that's exactly what a metagame is. Where this comes from is very clear to me, at least, is that it comes from people who only played Yu-Gi-Oh! With their friends super casually, and they didn't pay attention to the meta. They didn't even know it existed. In some cases, like myself, I didn't even know that Yu-Gi-Oh! Tournaments to a large capacity even were out there. I thought that it only went to a local level. I never thought that there'd be hundreds of players building decks that are worth thousands of dollars, even back in 2005, 2006, but that was happening. Just because I didn't know it was happening doesn't mean that it didn't happen, and that's where a lot of people have a lot of confusion when looking at old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Just because you weren't going to tournaments, just because you didn't know what the meta was, doesn't mean that those things didn't exist, and that is something that I see a ton of people leave comments about, because here's the deal. The good news is that even though people back in the day maybe didn't play as many archetypes, you can still play whatever casual deck you want to with your friends just like you could 20 years ago. You can change the rules, you can ban the latest cards, you can do whatever you want when you play outside of tournaments. That's one of the many awesome things about casual Yu-Gi-Oh! But don't pretend like you can't do that, and don't pretend like back in the day that's all anyone was doing. Even way back in 2003, there were still people that cared enough to go to the World Championship and play the best strategies out there, and when you go back and look at those World Championship deck lists, even the ones that weren't topping, they all look pretty similar. You have about like the same 30 cards in every single deck list, maybe even more standardized than nowadays when at least we have different decks topping. And I didn't make this video to make fun of any old school players. In fact, if you played during old school Yu-Gi-Oh! Competitively at least, you probably appreciate this video calling attention to some of the myths that people think about when they think of old school Yu-Gi-Oh! I think it's perfectly fine to play casually. I have nothing against that, and I myself didn't play with any of the real rules back in the day. I had no idea what a metagame was, or the fact that there were big tournaments. I just didn't know. I was a little kid. How was I supposed to know that? And that's fine, but then when I make videos about older cards, I can't take my experiences as a 5th grader and apply them to what was actually going on in competitive Yu-Gi-Oh! Back then. That's just not how this works. It's the same thing when we're talking about modern Yu-Gi-Oh! If you don't play at tournaments, if you only play casually, nothing wrong with that, but when you use those experiences and try to apply them to modern metagame discussions, well, obviously that is going to be kind of tough because you don't actually go to the tournaments where those metagames are happening. Anyway, though, I probably rambled on long enough. Hopefully you guys enjoyed today's video about these 5 myths about old school Yu-Gi-Oh! I tried really hard to get the ones that I found the most comments about in my own comment section. Hopefully you guys can understand that I couldn't cover everything in this video, but I tried to cover the 5 most prevalent ones that I personally see. I'll see you later though. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.